Good morning. Today we study about the socio-religious reform movements in India. First of all, we will study why these reform movements required. The conquest of India by the British during the 18th and 19th centuries exposed some serious weaknesses and drawbacks of Indian social institutions. As a consequence, several individuals and movements sought to bring about changes in the social and religious practices with the view to reforming and revitalizing for the society. So, if we study why we need reform, an important question for discussing is about the forces which generated this awakening in India. Uh, is it possible that it is the result of impact of West, or was it only a response to the colonial intervention? Although both these questions are interrelated, it would be profitable to separate them for a clear understanding. Another dimension of this is related to the changes taking place in Indian society, leading to the emergence of new classes. For this perspective, the social religious movements can be viewed as the expression of the social aspirations of the newly emerging middle class in colonial India. The early historical writings on reform movements have traced their original origin primarily to the impact of the West. Reform movements. The earliest expression of reform was in Bengal, initiated by Ram Mohan Roy. He founded the Atmiya Sabha in 1814, which was the forerunner of Brahmo Samaj, organized by him in 1829. The spirit of reform soon manifested itself in other parts of the country. The Paramhans Mandali and Pratna Samaj in Maharashtra and Arya Samaj in Punjab and other parts of North India were some of the prominent movements among the Hindus. There were several other regional and caste movements like Kayat Sabha in UP and Sarin Sabha in Punjab. Among the backward caste, two reforms struck roots: the Satya Shodhak Samaj in Maharashtra and Shri Narayan Dharm Paripalan Sabha in Kerala. The Ahmadiyya and Aligarh movement, the Singh Sabha and Rehnumai Majdisai Sabha represented the spirit of reform among the Muslim, the Sikh and the Parsis respectively. The following features are evident from all the above accounts. First, each of these reform movements was confined by and large to one region or the other. Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj did have branches in different parts of the country, yet they were more popular in Bengal and Punjab, respectively. These movements were confined to a particular religion or caste. An additional feature of these movements was that they all emerged at different point of time in different parts of the country. For example, in Bengal, reform efforts were afoot at the beginning of the 19th century, but in Kerala, they came up only towards the end of the 19th century. Despite this, there was considerable similarity in their aims and perspectives. All of them were concerned with the regeneration of society through social and educational reforms, even if there were differences in their methods. Scope of reforms. The reform movement of 19th century were not purely religious movements. They were socio-religious movements. The reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal, Gopal Hari Deshmukh in Maharashtra, and Veer Salingam in Andhra advocated religious reform for the sake of political advantage and social comfort. The reform perspectives of the movements and their leaders were characterized by a recognition of interconnection between religious and social issues. They attempted to make use of religious ideas to bring about changes in social institutions and practices. For example, Keshav Chandra Sen, an important Brahman leader, interpreted the unity of Godhead and brotherhood of mankind to eradicate caste distinctions in the society. The major social problems which came within the purview of the reform movement were emancipation of women, in which sati infanticide, child and widow marriage were taken up, casteism and untouchability, education for bringing about enlightenment in society. In the religious sphere, the main issues were idolatry, polytheism, religious superstitions, exploitation by priests, methods of reform. In the attempts to reform the socio religious practices, several methods were adopted. Four major trends of these are: first, reform from within. The technique of reform from within was initiated by Ram Mohan Roy and followed throughout the 19th century. The advocates of this method believe that any reform, in order to effective, had to emerge from within the society itself. As a result, the main thrust of their efforts was to create a sense of awareness among the people. They tried to do this by publishing tracts and organizing debates and discussion on various social problems. Ram Mohan Rai's campaign against sati, Vidyasagar's pamphlet on widow marriage, and B.M. Malbari's efforts to increase the age of the consent are the examples of this. Reforms through legislation. The second trend was represented by a faith in the efficacy of legislative intervention. The advocate of this method was Keshav Chandra Sen in Bengal, Mahadev Govind Ranade in Maharashtra, and Veer Selangam in Andhra. Believed that reform efforts cannot really be effective unless supported by the state. Therefore, they appealed to the government to give legislative sanction for reforms like widow remarriage, civil marriage, and increase in the age of consent. They, however, failed to realize that the interest of the British government in social reform was linked with its own narrow politico-economic consideration and that it would intervene only if it did not adversely affect its own interests. Third, reform through symbol of change. The third trend was an attempt to create symbols of change through non-conformist individual activity. This was limited to the Derusians and Young Bengal who represented a radical system within the reform movement. The members of this group, prominent of them being Dakshin Ranjan Mukherjee, Ram Gopal Ghosh, and Krishna Mohan Banerjee, stood for a rejection of tradition and revolt against accepted social norms. They were highly influenced by the regenerating new thought from the West and displayed an uncompromisingly rational attitude toward social problems. Ram Gopal Ghosh expressed the rationalist stance of this group when he declared, "He who will not reason is a bigot, he who cannot is a fool, and he who does not is a slave." A major weakness of the method they adopted was that it failed to draw upon the cultural tradition of Indian society, and hence the newly emerging middle class in Bengal found it too unorthodox to accept it. Fourth, reform through social work. The fourth trend was reform through social work, as was evident in the activities of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Arya Samaj, and Ramakrishna Mission. There was a clear recognition among them of the limitation of purely intellectual effort if undertaken without supportive social work. Vidyasagar was not content with advocating widow remarriage through lectures and publication of tracts. Perhaps the greatest humanist India saw in modern time, he identified himself with the cause of widow marriage and spent his entire life, energy, and money for this cause. Despite that, all he was able to achieve was just a few widow marriages. Vidyasagar's inability to achieve something substantial in practical terms was an indication of the limitation of social reform efforts in colonial India. The Arya Samaj and the Ramakrishna Mission also undertook social work through which they tried to disseminate ideas of reforms and regeneration. Their limitation was an insufficient realization on their part that reform on the social and intellectual planes is inseparably linked with the overall character and structure of the society. Constraints of the existing structure will define the limits which no regenerative efforts on the social and cultural place can exceed. As compared to the other reform movements, they depend less on the intervention of the colonial state and try to develop the idea of social work as CRE. In the evolution of modern India, the reform movements of the 19th century have made a very significant contribution. They stood for the democratizing of society, removal of superstition and abhorrent customs, spread of enlightenment, and the development of rational and modern outlook. Among the Muslims, the Aligarh and Ahmadiyya movement were the torchbearers of these ideas. The reform movements within the Hindu community attacked a number of social and religious evils, polytheism and idolatry, which negated the development of individuality or supernaturalism, and the authority of religious leaders, which introduced the habit of conformity, were subjected to strong criticism by these movements. The opposition to caste was not only on moral and ethical principles, but also because it fostered social division. Anti-casteism existed only at a theoretical and limited level in early Brahmo movement, but movements like the Arya Samaj, Pratna Samaj, and Ramakrishna Mission become uncompromisingly critics of the caste system. More trenchant criticism of the caste system was made by movements which emerged among the lower castes. This is the list of some of the organization and their founder like Atmiya Sabha. The founder is Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Next is Brahmo Samaj, founded by Raja Ram Mohan Rai. Dharm Sabha, Radhakant Dev. Tattva Bodhini Sabha, Devendranath Tagore. Paramhans Mandali, Deoband Pandurang. Rehmunai Majdasai Sabha, Dadabhai Nauroji. Radha Swami Satsang, Tulsi Ram, and also known as Shiv Dayal Sahib. Brahmo Samaj of India, Keshav Chandra Sen. Pratna Samaj, Dr. Atmaram Pandurang. Arya Samaj, Swami Dayanand. Theosophical Society, Blavatsky and Olcott. Brahmo Samaj, Anand. Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, Anand Mohan Bose. Thank you.